Well, thank you, Ross, for that kind of introduction, and thank you, Brooke, for organizing this presentation as well. Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, for having me here. So my talk for today is really about like my job market paper, or at least a summary of it, and it really deals with how important it really is the documents that the Federal Reserve are releasing to the public, especially the minutes that connect to their meetings. Now, to start with, this project has been motivated mainly by the evolution of the communication and the improvements in the frequency of the communication that the Fed has done over time. It started off with the Fed itself, with Alan Greenspan saying that if you really know what I'm saying, you really probably misunderstood me for the most part. So they're really trying their best to shroud policymaking in this regime of mystery and secrecy. They thought that before, when policy is secretive, it is actually the most influential and the most effective in attaining their objectives. However, they have faced a lot of scrutiny, not only in academics, but also with social and political aspects of their policy making. They were criticized that maybe it's actually more important and even more effective for them to actually be transparent about their policy making. And so we just see 14 years later that he actually reversed his own position, saying that openness is actually the obligation of a central bank in a free and democratic society. So we see that from being secretive, he already became even a lot more open and more transparent, not only about the policy making, but the explanation for why such policies have been implemented. Now, we can think of Alan Greenspan really as almost synonymous for a time with the Federal Reserve. Now, we've had a couple of changes in the Federal Reserve chairmanship, but we know that for the most part, its own objectives have not changed, in that it needs to set monetary policy to really attain maximum employment and stable prices. Really, it's things that are crucial and have been mandated to them by Congress in helping out our own economy. So they basically devote, since they are looking into economic indicators, they have devoted a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, in order to determine exactly what type of outlook are connected to these economic indicators. So they want to project over time what type of inflation and what type of employment we will be facing. Now, the main committee of the Federal Reserve that decides monetary policy is the Federal Open Market Committee. They include both the Board of Governors in the Federal Reserve System, as well as the Federal Reserve presidents. Now, the FOMC themselves, they go meet together about 8 times a year, as scheduled. They also have conferences to set and create and do some sort of public releases. We can think of this as either quantitative in nature, which are the conventional means of doing policy. So the federal funds target rate is that quantitative aspect in which they change the rate that banks can borrow, which the banks can borrow from one another. So the loans that they have overnight are being reflected by that federal funds target rate. On the other hand, that has not been looked at as much are the qualitative releases, which are either speeches or documents that they release about their meetings. So those speeches relay some information that can be conflicting from one another. And they relay and they convey information about the views from individual members themselves. However, collectively, they have their own views that they want to indicate to the public, and those are portrayed in the documents that are released, particularly those connected to the meetings. So they have statements and minutes for those meetings, which are released at most about 3 weeks after the meetings, as well as transcript of the actual the meetings, which are word-for-word records of the discussions within them. So since those word-for-word will be really important if they were released in a timely manner, but they're not because they're released after 5 years, so they're pretty stale already. However, what I'm going to look at today are the statements and the minutes, and the difference between the two are that the statements are released on the actual day of the meetings. right? And so since they are released on that same day when policy has been decided on, they are actually studied a lot more frequently together with the policy changes. They're also about a page long on average. So since they're a little short, they could contain some risk analysis on the risks faced by the dual mandate objectives, and so they also contain a very brief summary of the policy decision and why it was decided that way. On the contrary, we have the minutes, which are released 3 weeks afterwards, but they're 8 to 10 pages in length. And so since they're much longer, they do contain more information, more nuances about these discussions, and they relay even more economic information that may otherwise not have been given to the public. So now, we can then think, well, the minutes themselves are released 3 weeks afterwards, and they are about the same exact meeting that the statements were released by. So the statements are a short summary, whereas the minutes are a longer summary. We can then think, well, do the minutes really matter? The Fed argues that yes, they do matter, particularly because they do include more information and more explanation about what exactly goes on with policymaking. Okay? And what we see here then is that when we're looking at the lens of how important and how effective monetary policy is, we look at them through the lens of the financial markets. But, I mean, in the dual mandate objectives, we don't really care about the financial markets, right? We care about inflation, we care about the stable prices and maximum employment. Why look at the financial markets? The Fed then also explains, especially with Bernanke, a former chairman after Greenspan, he indicated with his co-author, Kartner, in the 2005 paper that the most direct and immediate impact of monetary policy is really gauged through the financial markets. So we see here that if we're thinking about, did we achieve our objectives? Did we do the right policy? Did we do enough policy changes? That's the gauge that they use in order to evaluate their actions is through these financial markets, given that they assume any changes in financial markets would transmit to the real economy eventually. All right? It might change the consumer choices. It might change investments in this economy. So the amount of borrowing in this economy could be affected as well. So now, a preliminary question is that, well, given that FOMC thinks about the financial markets as the gauge, and that the minutes themselves are another extension of the qualitative information released for the same meeting, do financial markets really care about these FOMC minutes? We can look at a graph and seeing the fluctuations of the financial markets on days when the minutes are released. So the days that minutes are released are on this red line, right? And I compare the days when there are minutes released to the days without. So these are the average fluctuations on minutes days releases versus without releases. And right on that red line, we see a big jump on minutes release days for the S&P 500, for the real estate investment trust, and some indices for other equity markets in other countries. Right, I looked at emerging markets as well and the Japanese index, and the fluctuations of the asset prices really jump up. Right, these are the standard deviations in statistics, and it's showing the volatility of these asset prices. So it's really saying that the jumps, the changes, which are either going up or going down more, are larger in magnitude. Okay? But in this preliminary result, we don't really distinguish between whether it's going up or down. And that mainly would depend on the type of information that the documents have. So my main question really is, what kinds of information are in these documents that are really triggering a certain type of reaction in these financial markets? So in order to figure out the types of information, I use a method called content analysis. It's a way of analyzing the textual evidence, textual information in these documents. And there are two ways of thinking about this. The first being a heuristic approach, which is a manually assessing the documents and you scoring them yourself based on your own judgment, based on your own assessment, and based on your own assessment of the information. Okay, some researchers have done that, but there are also the automated method, which is done algorithmically, and which some argue removes a lot of biases because it can be done more transparently and more objectively. Some papers have done this too. My main approach is somewhat a combination of the two, and I'm using a dictionary method in which it uses a bag of words that I've constructed and which is tailored for these set of documents that are relevant in order to systematically assess the type of information in these documents. I then use the Python natural language processing program in order to conduct this algorithm, which I am about to map out in the next slides. So the dictionary method, it requires me to first collect a document set that I am very much interested in. These include both the statements and the minutes from the period of the meetings from December of 2004 all the way to December of 2015. So that's my period of interest. I then collect a bag of key terms that are important in determining the assessments on of the risk on the dual mandate objectives. These key terms include keywords, which are those related to either inflation or unemployment. And so those are really narrowing down my assessment based on what's really important in these economic risks. The other type of key terms are the modifiers, which you can think of as either positive or negative words. So there can be adjectives, adverbs, or even some nouns, right, in the English lexicon. Now, these sets of key terms, I can categorize them using something called sentiments, which are the way in which these key terms, when placed together and analyzed based on their syntax, is evaluating the type of information about what type of monetary policy is more likely to happen. Okay? In particular, the sentiments look at economic outlook and examines how economic outlook can affect the expectations about policy. So there are two types of monetary policy that are in the two sides of the spectrum. The first one being contractionary monetary policy. So one type of sentiment is leaning towards that type of policy, and that is conducted when we see a more optimistic view about the economy, when we see more evidence of improving economic conditions, or we can also think about them when larger inflationary pressures are observed. So when we think that inflation is going to be high either in the very recent period coming up or in the farther away horizon. The opposite is the expansionary monetary policy leaning, which is trying to boost the economy if we think that the economy would have deteriorating outlook in the upcoming term. We can also observe expansionary monetary policy leading sentiments if inflation is subdued, the other type of dual mandate objective. And if prices are not going to rise that high, or if it's even going to contract, then this policy is even more likely. And I denote this as dovish, whereas contractionary monetary policy leading sentiments are denoted as hawkish. Now, to map out this automated content analysis method, the first step I do is, as I indicated, I create a list of keywords. And these keywords are those economic indicators or economic words that are important for the dual mandate objectives. So I'm going to show you a list of keywords earlier. I just want to point out that my set of list of keywords that I created are comparable to another paper that have gone through these same set of documents using the latent differential allocation method. So given this, it's more robust. I then have a list of keywords here. So I can have inflation, or we can also have economic. We have prices, financial growth. So these things connect to either employment or inflation in our assessment of risks. We then classify the type of keyword that we have. My analysis is really sentence level structure. So I would need to first assess the type of keyword that we have in order to then look at the modifiers and see what type of sentence do we really have. So the way I classify my keywords is based on whether those keywords give me a hawkish or dovish sentiment when connected to a certain kind of modifier. So take the keyword growth here. If I take the keyword growth and connect it to a positive modifier, which here is an adjective, faster, I have a faster growth as a phrase. And faster growth gives me a hawkish sentiment, right? Because it's saying that we could potentially have larger employment levels in the future with faster growth, or we can have like inflation rising. If I instead connect a keyword to a negative adjective, that gives me the opposite effect, which is a dovish sentiment. Given this framework, this is what I refer to as a hawkish keyword. On the other hand, if I take another keyword, let's take unemployment, and stick a positive adjective right in front of it or right beside it, if it gives me a dovish sentiment, while attaching a negative adjective gives me a hawkish sentiment, that is a dovish keyword. So some list of hawkish and dovish keywords. For hawkish keywords, I have employment, growth, and manufacturing, whereas with dovish, I have accommodation, downturn, and unemployment. Now, to assess my sentences, I also have a list of modifiers. So these, again, are positive or negative words, adjectives, adverbs, or nouns. And going through the list of documents that I have a bag of these terms. So we see here that the positive ones include accelerated, raise, and strengthens, whereas negative have dampen, fall, and weaken. I just want to point out here that typically in these kind of studies, they remove the conjugation of the word, and they only take the root because they assume or they find that it's not really changing the syntax. But in this particular group of documents, we actually see that just changing even one conjugation of word, it really changes the meaning of the sentence. So I've kept the conjugation, as you can see in this list of words. Now, having all these lists of words, the keywords and modifiers, I then collect all the sentences in each document that contain keywords. I then remove everything else that does not. So basically, I can just focus on these sentences that really talk about economic indicators. I then collect them and count the number of sentences I have left, and then enumerate just what kind of sentiment these sentences have. So the first one is that I first determine the type of keyword that I have. If I have a hawkish keyword, I then look at, well, do I have more positive or negative modifiers? If I have more positive than negative, I score it a +1. Whereas if that sentence with a hawkish keyword has more negative than positive modifiers, I score it a -1. The opposite metric is used when I have a dovish keyword. In that, if I have more positive than negative modifiers, I score it a -1. And the opposite, which is more negative than positive, it's a +1, which is a hawkish sentiment. Now, if they have the same number of modifiers in my analogy, they just score a 0. Some examples include a sentence from the May 24, 2005 minutes that says that, according to survey information, expectations of near-term inflation picked up in March, consistent with the increase in energy prices. You see here first that there are no capitalizations, so I remove the uppercase, and I remove the punctuations, because those don't really add any message, or at least I'm assuming that they don't add any additional information. I then look at the type of keywords that I have here. Both are hawkish keywords. And I see that they have positive modifiers in this sentence, up and increase. Given my scoring metric, this is a +1 or hawkish sentence that I have in the document. Another example that I have is from the August 2014 minutes. That goes, initial claims for unemployment insurance declined further in recent weeks. This one here has a dovish keyword, but we only find one negative modifier. And according to the scoring metric, still a hawkish sentence. I've done this type of scoring for each of the sentences that has keywords. And then I aggregate the individual sentences, divide by the number of sentences I evaluate, and scale by 100. That way, I have a score that's between negative 100 to 100 for each of the document that I have, right, for the statements and the minutes. And I also control for other different characteristics, such as having negation, which is no, not, or never, or keywords of different types, in which I only account for them as something that only has hawkish keywords. So just to interpret the documents that we have, again, between negative 100 to 100, and the higher the score is, the more hawkish it is. The lower it is, the more dovish. And so if we map out the scores, the aggregated scores, for the minutes here, we map it out from the minutes of December 2004 to December 2015 meetings. We see that in this, and put in this figure, the gray bar here is when the Great Recession happened. We see that prior to the recession, the minute sentiments tend to be more hawkish in nature, meaning that they're either worried about inflation, and also they're also seeing that the view about the economy is pretty positive, pretty optimistic. We then see that as the recession actually occurred, the sentiment actually started declining. We see some signs that, well, maybe the economy is weakening, and then we see that it continued to be lower until the zero lower bound period, in which the federal funds target rate just hit its zero level. Okay? And then during the recovery period, it bounced back up. These are for the minutes. We can also look at them in correspondence with their statement sentiment score. So when I look at the statements, I see a very similar pattern, although it's a little more volatile. It moves a lot more. Right? So we see here that it's still hawkish in the beginning. It declines. It's a little noisier, and then it bounces back up. So we're seeing here that the statements and the minutes kind of reflect a similar pattern. Right? But in certain aspects, they do diverge a little bit, such as in here, where we see a higher statements than the minutes, and a lower statement here than the minutes. So they are emphasizing the changes more than what we have in the minutes. So then we have the sentiments for the documents. We then want to see how exactly are these sentiments affecting financial markets, our gauge of how policy is affecting or potentially affecting our economy. And when we look at these minutes or the sentiments, we see that the minutes go afterward. So I focus my attention on days when the minutes releases occur, and I want to see how asset valuation changes on those particular days when the minutes are released. Given that there's a lot of research already on statements, and that statements may already have been priced in the markets when minutes are released. So we see that market fluctuations occur during minutes release days. Exactly what type of movements are we talking about here? So I do an empirical analysis using two stages. The first stage assumes that the statements are perfectly priced in based on the information they have on the asset prices right before the minutes are released. Now, if that's the case, then any sort of changes in the financial markets are those that are exactly unexpected. If you find that there's new information that you did not really realize back in the statements, or you just did not know about, that's the one that's going to cause the changes. Also, it cannot be predictable based on some sort of pattern that we observed beforehand. So anything that's not predictable and new are really the ones that are triggering the financial market movements. So then, to address the information that might have been in the statements, I first just standardize the sentiment scores for each type of document and take their simple difference. When I take the difference, I then get a measure called the relative sentiment score, or relative hawkishness score. What I then do is to take this relative score and to see whether it's predictable at all from observations of previous meetings. This is important given that economic indicators don't really change that much, at least not very fast. They change over time, but they change very gradually. So the wording of these documents seem to be pretty persistent over time. So we want to know what is the predictable aspect of the relative difference and what is not, because we really care about what is not predictable. So we want to get that part, that component that is not expected. Right? And in order for me to get the part that's not expected, I use a method called maximum likelihood to tease out the expectations. So that using this method, I'm able to obtain the expected component and remove that from the actual relative sentiments of the documents. The difference being the news shock, that surprise or information component of the minutes, and which are really what is triggering the effect on financial markets. This is the part, this NST or news shock, is the part that I bring into my second stage, in which I use a regression analysis. There's more caveats to here, because financial markets, if you want to look at how it's being impacted by a certain policy, you need to isolate everything else to make sure that you hone in to the actual impact of that particular policy. So what I do is to look at the intraday change, meaning that how did market valuation change right when the minutes are released until the end of the trading day. So I look at the change from 10 minutes prior to release to 2 hours afterwards, so that at that particular chunk of time, there's not really much information affecting the valuation aside from the information in the minutes. I also account for other control variables that may be important for market valuation, such as the VIX and the day of the week it's been done. I also consider one caveat, but actually a big one, is I also consider the fact that these documents could have offsetting effects. So that's the last part that I want to talk about before going with the results, is that, for instance, if we find a surprise optimism in this document, it could be that this surprise optimism gives us a positive economic outlook, which you might have guessed is bringing in a positive impact on financial markets. Okay? But on the other hand, since the policymakers themselves view these economic indicators and say, given that we have optimism about the economy, we're going to have a higher likelihood we're considering contractionary monetary policy a little bit more. But the impact of that is a negative impact on market valuation. So we see here a positive and negative, which is offsetting. If they're offsetting each other, we want to make sure that we can isolate some sort of effect. And to do that, we take advantage of the time period of the data, in which the FOMC has set the zero lower bound. The rates are at the zero level, or around the zero level on some sort of range. And they're basically adding in more information in the documents saying that we are keeping this zero lower bound for a given period of time. At first, they only indicate dates, and then they say we won't change the policy until we hit a given level of economic indicators, right? Which we have hit, which is for employment levels and for inflation levels. We won't change it until we hit those thresholds. And these basically go for August 2011 until about right before the change in policy in December 2016. And we see here that given this framework and applying what we talked about, we eliminate that right part. Okay? We don't worry so much about any much uncertainty about policy. It's still possible to have uncertainty, but not to the extent that we had before. Because now there's a lot more people who feel more comfortable with interpreting the documents as just having one particular effect that's dominating the rest. And we check that and we put that in our regression, and I find in my empirical results that a positive news shock, maybe an optimism about the economy or about stronger inflation pressures, are really resulting to a positive and significant effect on the S&P 500 broad stock index, a positive effect on the real estate investment trust index, as well as some indices for other emerging markets in other countries. We also find that the magnitude of the change is actually pretty comparable to any sort of to quantified measures, to calculated measures for the conventional policy that has been implemented earlier. So it's about a fraction, but a significant fraction of the impact for the S&P 500, and especially for the real estate investment trust in the US. So now, one final aspect is, well, how do we interpret these results? We have the numbers from our empirical analysis. We then want to see what exactly are in these new shocks. And when we look at them, they can either be unexpected optimism or about inflation projections, right, being really high. So are we seeing a combination of both, or really just one or the other? And when we look at the documents, the minutes from November 22, 2011 indicate that consumer prices for food and energy increased last quarter at a slower pace, and consumer prices are a bit less. It's even more pronounced in the February 2013 when the board governor's staff continued to project that inflation would be subdued through 2015. So in here, it's saying that inflation is subdued. So any unexpected optimism or any sort of positive news shock is really due to unexpected optimism about the economy. Okay, maybe we did not expect it, but the recovery is actually underway. It's actually projected that we're actually getting out of this downturn a little bit further, okay, at least as a whole economy. We can also look at the inflation measures, and we see here that that blue line is when I start my analysis for the information-based forward guidance, and I see here that the effect, the inflation is around the target right in the beginning, but then it fell below the target of 2% for inflation throughout the time period, meaning that the outlook for inflation was right, but it was actually low, and we observed that it was low for a significant period of time. So therefore, any sort of unexpected optimism is what's driving the result of a positive news shock. So really putting them together, the surprise optimism about the economy that is really expressed from these FOMC documents, when they are given in a period when you promise and commit to that same policy for a given period of time, really is driving the financial markets to be positive. Right? So under the right conditions, on the right time, you're seeing that even these words are really giving a positive impact and really significant impact on the financial markets. So if you're thinking that financial markets is a gauge that could really ripple down to the economy, then words do matter, and that whatever you say is really going to help the economy in the long run. So to conclude, we have financial markets really depend on the type of surprise document information, and that during this information date-based forward guidance, right, this particular period of time, the positive news, the surprise optimism really is driving the results, right, and really is giving a positive impact on financial markets. Findings confirm really the importance that monetary policy communication has to be optimized, or else you might just bring more confusion, or you might produce an unintended result. The impact of financial markets really are important, at least the Federal Reserve argues are important, given that they transmit to the real economy. So we want to pay attention to what's happening to the financial markets if we do believe that eventually businesses, consumers, and just the whole economy as a whole would benefit from its rise. At least when it's increasing due to fundamentals and something, not something else. Now, implications of these results are that any additional information, even if they just clarify questions or uncertainty about policy, even if you've talked about them before, could really make a difference, right? Because the minutes themselves are an extended clarification of what happened in the meetings. You try to explain it through the statements, maybe the post interview with the chairman, but even then, you're still seeing that the minutes themselves actually make a difference. So we see here that it's really important to pay attention to what type of wording the documents have and to think about how this information is conveyed, given that they have very influential in affecting your financial market and just achieving your results. One caveat here too, just to end with this remark, is that enough information is optimal. You don't want to give too much information that just causes more confusion. Right? You don't want to have any misleading information that you don't need, but at the same time, you want to give enough so that you don't leave too much uncertainty. And with that, I just want to thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take any questions. That one thing is to pay attention to what the minutes say and potentially trying to convey that in the statements already. That way, if the statements can be used to correct any sort of problems that have been indicated in the statements, so you can use it as a correction mechanism instead of just producing more than what should have been conveyed already in the statements. Is there a question? I didn't use that method because basically I created my own set of words, the back of words that have been used to analyze the sentences. But I've compared that with other methods that have used LDA that have gone through the same set of documents. I could not do the machine learning because the set of documents are only about 89 for the minutes, so they're very small. So given that, I can't really remove too much. Yes, at the back.